Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to assemble this 1/48th scale T3485 kit by Hobby Boss. This is the first time I've built anything by Hobby Boss, so I'm not really sure what I should be expecting in terms of quality. This kit cost a total of 18 Australian dollars, so I'm not expecting it to be the most amazing kit ever, but I am hoping for something a little better than, say, an Airfix kit. The front of the box has an image of the T3485, as you would expect. It also lists the dimensions of the completed model, those being 168mm long, 62.6mm wide, and 57.9mm tall. It also says there are 400 pieces, and I hadn't actually noticed that when I bought the kit. I was mostly interested in the fact that it was cheap, a T3485, and in 1/48th scale. There's nothing of interest on the rear of the box, so let's get right to looking at what's inside the box. Because there are 400 pieces in this kit, it's not at all surprising that there are also quite a few sprues. They all come individually bagged, which is great if parts do happen to come off of those sprues. I'm not going to have a detailed look at all of these sprues, because doing so would add another 30 or 40 minutes to the length of this video. Most of the parts in this kit are reasonably well detailed, and while some of them do have some fairly obvious mold lines, none of them are horrendously bad, and shouldn't take much time or effort to clean up. Though the plastic does feel a little, I'm not sure of the right word, it feels a little weak maybe. It's not awful, but I don't think it will stand up to too much rough handling, and care should be taken when removing the parts from the sprues. The wargaming kits I usually build seem to be made of sturdier stuff most of the time. The reasons for that are probably obvious. There is so much internal detailing for this tank. Despite the couple of images on the box, I wasn't expecting it to be so extensive. I'm going to have to pick and choose what I do install. It seems pointless to build an entire engine if it won't be seen. I am of course going to leave some hatches open so the detail I do include can be seen. The tracks come as a series of partially built lengths of track and some individual links. I was actually expecting rubber band tracks in a kit at this price, so this was a nice surprise. I also quite like the included jigs that are intended to help with track assembly. It's a thoughtful inclusion. Hopefully those go together well. The upper and lower hull parts come in their own cardboard enclosure, presumably to protect the parts from damage. For some reason, this is pretty heavily glued together. The parts do look good, but as you can see, there's quite a bit of flashing on the upper hull, especially in the vents. No big deal really. There's also some clear plastic lenses for headlamps, cable that is actual metal cable, and this combined plastic and photo-etched vent part that goes on the rear of the hull. Very nice. The instruction booklet is verging on being an actual book. There's a lot in there. Page after page of instructions. That's good though. With a kit like this, you don't want to just be guessing at where the parts go. At first glance, these instructions seem like they will be easy enough to understand and follow. There's also this painting and marking guide. It's not especially detailed, but it might be useful. And speaking of markings, this decal sheet is also included. They come in a protective bag and have paper over the front of them, so you can't really see them very well. I'm leaving them in the bag until I paint this tank so they don't get damaged. Let's get started building this thing. This video is going to be kind of in-depth, so grab a snack and a refreshing beverage. This is going to take a while. The first step is to assemble these inner wall parts with suspension. These each consist of two of part B20, which are these springy shock absorber things. They are simply glued into these inner wall parts. The first one is part C40. The shock absorber should be glued in with the loop towards the bottom of the part like so. You can tell already this kit is going to have a lot of detail that will probably never be seen. You should end up with 4 of these assemblies. C40 goes in the right rear, C36 goes in the left rear, E24 goes in the left middle, and E25 goes in the right middle. Before we put them in the hull though, the instructions say to add some more details. Part E24 receives this little thing. It's part C29 and it slots right onto the raised rectangular guidepost. I obviously don't know what it is. E25 receives this pair of stowed rounds. They are part number D6, and they simply glue into place here like so. This pair of shells needed quite a bit of cleanup to remove mold lines, but they ended up looking pretty good. The next step involves adding some internal detail to the front of the hull. I start this by removing the flash and mold lines from the lower hull part. I first add part C11, which is some kind of set of air tanks or maybe fire extinguishers or something. This part has a slot cut into it to help guide its positioning. Be careful not to break off the little valve things on the end. Next comes part C21, which is a something. It looks like it might be the end of an axle for the idler wheel. You should get used to me not knowing what all of the parts are actually called. This part was a little bit fiddly to position, but I got it on eventually. Then comes another part I can't identify. C7, a cylindrical thing, goes here in this slot in the floor. I had to use tweezers and my knife to manipulate it into place. This is what it should look like so far. Then we can glue part B25 into the side of the hull here. It's obviously a shock absorber, presumably for the leading road wheel. Again, a little fiddly to position, but using tweezers and a knife, or any other pointy tool to nudge the part around does help. The same steps can be repeated for the other side of the hull. The parts are numbered the same way except for the axle hub thing, which for the left side is C20. In addition to all of those parts, this can be glued in. It's part C28 and it's some kind of pedal. It's not hard to get into place, but it's small and looks easy to break, so be careful. Onwards to step 3, the first part of which requires us to install part E5, which is a large cluster of boxes. I believe most of these are cases of ammo for the main gun. This part is really easy to glue into place. There are guide holes for it in the floor and they should hold it in place fairly firmly. Of course, the glue will hold it in place even more firmly. The arrangement of the pins and holes means this part will be hard to put in the wrong way. Next, I take part E6, which will be the front right internal hull wall, and then I glue part E16 to it. Nothing too tricky about this. I believe this is a rack full of magazines for the hull machine gun. Following this, I glue on another pair of stowed main gun rounds. These are parts D6, and again they needed a good bit of mold line removal. It would be silly to have a right internal wall without a left side counterpart, and that would be part C2 here. Onto that, I glued this part, C19. It goes on easily enough. It's some kind of control panel or something, I think. Next, I attach part C31, which is some kind of handle. I'm not sure I got this in exactly the right place. There was nothing to guide it. Also, it was very fiddly, but eventually I got there. Then, I glue on another rather fiddly part, C15, which is some kind of valve with a hose attached to it. I use my knife to nudge this around, and eventually I get it into place and am satisfied with it. There's a lot of detail on this piece. It's a shame that it will barely be visible. Next, both of the internal wall assemblies can be glued into the lower hull. This is pretty simple, though of course do be careful when applying pressure to these parts. It would be annoying to have fiddled with them so much only to break them now. In this next step, the internal wall and suspension assemblies need to be glued into the lower hull. This is pretty simple if you remember which assembly is which and where they go. They all look different enough that you should be able to tell which is which with the aid of the instructions. These parts all went into place very easily and I have no complaints. Though I do kind of wonder if any of this suspension detail will be visible at all when the wheels are glued on. I guess even if it isn't, I'll know it's there. Is that enough? Probably not, but it's not like it was a lot of extra work to glue those shock absorbers in anyway. During this step while installing the rear wall parts, we should also glue in a couple of boxes that look like they could be batteries. I've decided that I won't be building the actual engine in this model, so I don't bother installing those parts. I test fit the hull top now, just to make sure it will fit on with the internal components installed. If we need to make any corrections, best to do so now. Next, the instructions instruct us to put together a couple of seats for the driver, part C23, and hull gunner, part C24. These are quite easy to put together. All we have to do is glue the armrests onto the sides of the two chairs. These are part C8. I would never have expected such a luxury as armrests in a Soviet tank, but there they are. The driver's seat has its own legs, but the gunner's seat rests on top of a box. I assume it's a drawer or something for storing useful items. Or vodka. The box is part C18 and the detail part I glued onto the front is part C17. The chair is then glued onto the box. There's a keying to ensure it goes together correctly. Looks, well, probably not all that comfortable. I set those aside for now. Before installing them, the instructions say to add some controls for the driver. I start with the pedals. These are parts C22, and I'm glad this is a single piece. There's a couple of slots for this to fit into, and it goes into place relatively easily, though some nudging with a knife or other tool is needed. Next come the steering levers, or tillers, or whatever they're called. These are both part C16 and they're quite fragile, so definitely be careful with these. A little fiddling was of course needed, but I was surprised by how easily I got these nicely into place. The actual handle part should be facing more towards the front of the tank. Then comes the gear shifter, for shifting gears, obviously. This is part C14. I'm so used to these being on the left that at first I thought it was some kind of control for the hull gunner, but no, it's the gear stick for the driver, though I guess the other guy could play with it too if he wants. Now we can install the seats. The hull gunner's seat has a nice raised rectangle to guide its positioning. I was a bit hesitant to stick my fingers too far in there, so I used my knife to nudge the part into place and minimise the risk of breaking those levers with my fat fingers. The driver's seat is next. The hull has a couple of holes in it to align with the legs of the seat. Both of these seats were very easy to get into place, and using the knife means I managed to do so without destroying the detail in the driving compartment, which I think looks really cool. It's probably going to be a pain in the posterior to paint, but it really does look very cool. Next, I install this, part E17. It goes into place easily enough. I'm not sure what exactly it is, but I think it's part of the electrical or hydraulic system that allows the turret to rotate without breaking those connections. To finish the driver's compartment, I add this handily switchy thing. It's part C25 and it goes between the two pedals like so. Like pretty much all of the parts, it needed a gentle nudging into place. I am unaware of what its function is. If I had to guess, I would say it's the starting handle or something to do with the air system. Step 6 has us doing more work on the outside of the tank. I start by gluing in the escape hatch. This is part B6 and it goes into place very easily. I was a little bit sloppy with the glue on the underside, but that shouldn't matter. It is a small, easily overlooked detail, but I do like that it's a separate part and it can be modelled open. Next, I glue on part number L9. This is the lower hull rear and final drive cover bulge things. It's pretty simple to position. The round panel with the bolt details on the bottom of the hull help a lot with this. I let the glue set for a bit before adding the outer parts of the final drive. In the meantime, I add some suspension gear. The forward suspension arm thing part on the left side is number B27. The forward arms are different to the rest. This has a hexagonal keying so it can be put on correctly or at a few other very incorrect angles. Next, there are 4 of these parts. They are B28. They easily go into the holes down the side of the hull. Of course, be sure to slot the pin on the back of the suspension arm into the loop on the back of the shock absorbers. This helps ensure proper positioning. After a short time, you should end up with 5 sets of suspension arm axle bits ready for wheels, which will be attached later. The same process can be repeated for the right side of the tank. The only differences are that the leading suspension arm part is number B27 and the other 4 parts are B29. Next comes the axle for the idler wheels at the front of the hull. These are keyed, but they can still be put on backwards. They should be around this way with the axle more forward and away from the hull, rather than rearward towards the hull. It can be glued into place like so. Very easy. The part for both sides is B2, and they're identical, so there's no way to put the wrong part on the wrong side. I then add the ends of the final drives. Again, these parts, B26, are identical. There is a recess for the small circular part that acts as a guide for these, making it impossible for all but the most determined to put this on wrong. The next step involves building the engine. I have decided that the only hatch that would allow the engine to be seen is going to be closed on my tank, so I'm going to skip this step and move on to building the transmission. The transmission is going to need something to sit on, so I glue in parts A5 and A6 like so. These are just simple supports for the transmission, and they are very unlikely to be visible, so I don't worry too much about getting these in neatly. Next, I join parts A9 and A8 together. These are the main body of the transmission. I don't worry too much about cleaning these up. I figured they'd be all greasy and not so neat looking. They'll barely be visible anyway. I then glue part A36 onto A35. These parts are keyed so they only go together one way. I glued that assembly onto the post or axle on the left of the transmission casing like so. Parts A37 and A38 go together in the same way and are glued onto the right side of the transmission thusly. I then dry fit the transmission and whole rear to get an idea of what will be visible. Turns out, not a whole lot. The hatch is quite small. I decided I should still put all of the transmission detail in anyway. Next, I glue this brackety axle thing to the end of the transmission with the hole. It's part A24 and it's keyed to ensure it goes on the correct way. This part will hold the fan on and help get the transmission into the correct position. I glued the transmission into place. Nothing especially tricky about this. Next comes part A27. I accidentally cut this in two when removing it from the sprue. Not to worry, I glued the two halves on anyway and then kajigger them so it looks like one part. It's easier to do it this way than trying to glue the two halves together and then glue that onto the transmission. It's not perfect, but it will be okay. Then I glue on part A26. I have no idea what it is, maybe the alternator or something. Either way, it goes there atop the transmission. Then, because I am pretty sure it will be at least a little bit visible through the hatch, I assemble the fan. This consists of parts A23, onto which I glue A40, followed by A47, and then A39. The ring around the end of the fan is keyed to lock into place if you install it the right way up, which makes it really easy to get into position. I then glue the fan onto its mounting post on the transmission. It's barely going to be seen, but it should at least block the view into the engine compartment. I then put together whatever these things are. Air filters, I think. I built the left one first. This is parts A2 and A4. Part A54 goes on top here. This is keyed so it can only go on one way. I didn't worry about cleaning these parts up, so they do look a little bit rough. Part A16, which is an exhaust pipe, goes onto the side of the filter thing like so. The parts for the air filter for the right side of the tank are different, but the assembly is much the same. Next, both air filter and exhaust pipe assemblies can be glued to the internal wall, part C3, that goes between the engine and transmission compartments. There's slots and holes for it, and it goes into place easily enough. That entire assembly can then be glued into the hull. It doesn't quite just slot into place, but it does go into place easily enough. There are guides on the walls for correct placement. We're not quite done here. There's one more thing to add. Part A51, which is a pipe of some sort that goes between the two things I've assumed are the air filters. The fit isn't quite right and I fiddled with it a fair bit, but eventually gave up getting these parts perfectly into place. They will barely be seen anyway, so I figure it's not all that important. And that's all I'm going to do with the internal parts of this model. I think it looks quite good, and despite the fact that it looks kind of complex, it wasn't especially tricky to build. It will probably be a bit hard to paint, but even then, a good coating of engine grime on everything and it should look good. Next, I glue in the wall that goes between the engine and crew compartments. This is part C1, and it goes into place very easily, though I did need to apply a little pressure for it to click into place. I then test fit the upper hull again, just to make sure it all still fits together well enough. And it does. Let's move on to some external details. I start by gluing in this engine hatch. This is part C4. Please insert joke about explosives here. You can see the openings on either side of this hatch for some louvers. It looks messy because I haven't bothered cleaning up those openings. I glue on the vent cover things that go over these openings. These are part E27 on the left of the tank and E28 on the right. You can't see through these, that's why I didn't bother installing the louvers or cleaning up the openings. As you can see, there's a gap towards the rear of these parts. That can be covered by part C6 here. I had to press it into place with my knife. It was easily done, though there's still a bit of a gap there. At least it looks better than before. Next, there are some louvers that are meant to go into the opening over the transmission compartment. I wanted to model these open because the grille over this area will be see-through, but it turns out the parts didn't fit very well. They wouldn't stay in place when I tried to mount them in the open position. These parts are number B14, but I'm leaving them off out of frustration. Leaving these out will just make it easier to see down into the transmission compartment. Next, I glue on the upper hull rear. This is part L5. It goes into place very easily. There is a bit of a gap around this part, but that's okay. The real thing has a gap there too. Sometimes quite a big gap. Such is the way of glorious Soviet construction. I continue adding details to the hull as the instructions suggest. I glue on part B19, which is a simple toolbox that goes here on the right rear of the hull. The 3 bumps represent the hinges and should go in towards the hull. Next, I glue on part B3. This is the hinge that holds the transmission access hatch. It's a good idea to use the actual hatch part to ensure the hinge is correctly positioned. Of course, be sure you don't accidentally get glue on it and get it stuck there. Unless of course that's where you want the hatch. I don't. I want the hatch to be open so I can see inside, and so that's how I glue the hatch into place. The hatch is part B5. I'm not sure if it should be open that far, but it looks fine to me. Then I assemble 2 exhausts. These are both identical and are comprised of the pipes being part B18 and the covers being part B30. The pipes have a notch in them that locks into the inside of the covers and they go together very easily. I like that the pipes are tube-shaped and don't have flat ends. The assembled exhausts can then be glued onto the rear plate. They have pins that help them go on correctly, though if you wanted, you could probably glue them on upside down. Then I take this pile of things, all part B11. They kind of look like spare track links, but not quite. They're a different shape and size compared to the actual links in the track sets. I think they might be grousers or cleats for snow or something like that. Whatever they are, I just pile them up on the side of the hull like so. They're small and fiddly, so a tool to nudge them into position is helpful. You could of course leave them off if you want, but I think they will add some interest to the side of the tank that would otherwise just be a large mass of green when it's painted. Next, the instructions say to make rear and side fuel tanks. I only want side tanks, so I didn't bother making the rear ones. I start by taking parts E11 and E12 and gluing them together to form the center of the fuel tanks. They're not quite perfect, but they can be fixed later with putty. Then come parts E13 and E14, which are obviously the ends of the drums. These are keyed to ensure a correct fit with the legs all protruding from one side of the barrel. It would look silly if they were facing different ways, and Stalin would probably send you to the gulag. I then glue on part E7, which is this bar. I'm not entirely sure if I'm getting the position of this right, but it looks close enough based on the diagrams in the instructions. It's a bit fiddly, so I use my knife to nudge the part to where I want it. The result is also a little bit messy, but we can probably cover that up with some weathering. I then glue the fuel drums into place. You can see there's some very faint markings to help with positioning these. The little rectangles aren't recessed or anything, they just serve to mark the points where the legs of the fuel drums should attach. The instructions don't say to glue these on until later, but I'm going to add them now anyway because I'm a rebel. Ooh. I glue them on as neatly as I could. You could put these on however you want, they're not permanently attached to the tank. I decided to put all 3 on, 2 on the right and 1 on the left. They do look a little bit messy, but Russia is not too bad. Now to move on to adding details to the front of the hull, starting with the driver's hatch. This is comprised of a few parts. I start by gluing the vision device covers to the internal half of the hatch, which is part C33. The little handles should be facing downward. The covers and handly part is C32. They glue together fairly easily, and you could model the covers open or closed. I then glued the armoured covers to the outer half of the hatch, which is part C34. The left cover is part C37, and the right is C38. These go on pretty easily though, as with most of the small parts in this kit, I had to nudge them around with my knife before I was happy with their placement. You could model these open if you wanted. I've chosen to have them closed, and as such have omitted the actual vision device part that would sit underneath the armoured covers. I then glue both halves of the hatch together. This looks simple. There's a pin and hole to help guide its positioning, but it only really half helps. There's a lot of play in the parts and you have to try and get the inner part as centered as you can. It's not too hard, but it is a little bit fiddly. I then take the hinge, part C35, test fit it, and then glue it on in the appropriate location, which should be obvious. I joined the hatch and hinge part now because it didn't seem like I would be able to get the hatch part to hook into the hinge part after it was glued into place. I'm building this open, so I did have to hold it open for a while as the glue set. I'm not sure that the angle at which the hatch is open is realistic, but it looks fine to me. Next comes the saw, part B10. There's a couple of marks on the side of the hull to guide its positioning. The traditional Soviet log isn't included with this kit, but the saw will allow the tank crew to obtain log if needed. I follow that with part B4, which is some kind of shackle thing. And then the headlamp, part E21. This was a little bit fiddly to get into place. There's a transparent lens to add to this part, but I won't be adding that until after the painting for obvious reasons. Time for some tiny fiddly parts. These are part B13, and there is one for each side. They seem to be little latch things for the hook things that will go into place below this part. These are both part B7, and again, there's one for each side, and they go into place like so. The recess for these parts is a lot larger than the base of the part, which makes it look a bit messy. This will need some filling. At any rate, this part should be installed with the longer protrusion facing upwards. I then install this thing. It's some kind of clip or shackle, and it's very tiny. This is part L4. This wasn't too hard to install using tweezers. You definitely want tweezers though, and something to nudge the part into the correct orientation. The instructions seem to suggest that this should be sitting 90 degrees to the front plate with the opening facing upwards like so. Next come the spare track links. I like that there is detail on the underside even though it will never be seen. I guess you could use this part for other things if you didn't want to add it to the tank. Anyway, it's part E15 and it goes in here very easily, guided by a couple of pins. Then comes this horn. This is part B17. Joke about bombers goes here. It faces towards the rear of the tank. Next, we need to build a toolbox. There are two of part B12. These need to be glued into the ends of part B9. This is pretty easy and it forms a nice toolbox which we can then glue into place at the left front of the hull. The two latches should be facing outwards. Then the instructions suggest assembling the idler wheels and drive sprockets, so I figure why not, and I do that. The inner half of the idler wheel is part B23 and the outer half is B24. These parts are keyed to ensure easy and correct fitting. Next, the drive sprocket. The inner half is B22 and the outer part B21. As you can see, these are also keyed. The pin goes into the holes, obviously. The parts didn't quite go all the way together, but it doesn't look too bad. Now to make some cable. I quite like that the cable is actual metal cable. It should look quite realistic once it's painted up. I used the measuring guide in the instructions to cut the cable into two sections roughly 90mm long. You could of course use your own measuring implement if you would prefer. Then, using super glue, because plastic cement won't work on the cable, I glue the ends of the cables on. These are part B31. I rolled the ends of the cable between my fingers so the ends wouldn't be so frayed, and so they would fit into the ends of the plastic part easier. Looks very good and cable-y. Good for towing. The instructions now want us to return to the inside of the hull to add a few more details to the driver's area. First, part C9, which is another rack of machine gun ammo magazines. It goes into place easily enough. It's angled to fit against the slope of the hull. It does hang down a little bit, so be careful with it. You don't want to break it off. Next, the driver needs an instrument panel, so I glue one in. It's part C30 and it also goes into place quite easily. I then install part C27. This is part of the driver's hatch. It's the hatch holdy opening mechanism, which is the technical term. The part doesn't quite make contact with the hatch itself here. I might have it open too far. This might have been better to make as two parts. That way you could customize how open the hatch is and still have the part connected to the hull and hatch properly. Oh well, it'll barely be visible anyway, so it doesn't bother me too much. Next comes part C26, which is the mounting for the hull machine gun. After initially dropping the part into place backwards, I had to fiddle quite a bit to get this to sit nicely. And I did that out of frame because I am a dumb. It ended up looking a little bit messy, but it's a Soviet tank. Messy isn't exactly a bad thing, and hopefully I can cover it with the next part, which is C10, the outer portion of the machine gun. This isn't too hard to position. It kind of hides the mess behind it, but I'm not entirely satisfied with this part of the model. Nothing I can do about it now though, I guess. I did also glue the stock of the machine gun inside the hull, but I must have forgot to hit record because I don't seem to have a clip for it. Moving on, there's a few more details to add to the outside of the hull. First, this grille part. I had initially intended to leave this off until after painting, but now that the louvers are not installed, I don't think that will be necessary because I'll be able to get the paint into the cavity with my airbrush. The part is a little bit bent, probably because of the metal inside of it, but that's not a big issue, and I think it's worth it for that nice see-through mesh. I rather like it. I like that the metal part is already installed in the plastic, so you don't need to futz around with super glue. I glue the part into place and it fits well, though I found I had to apply a little pressure until the glue set to get it to sit nicely. The metal component kind of adds a springiness to the part. Then I add some hand railings. In an attempt to avoid making a mess with the glue, I apply the glue from the inside of the hull. These handrails are really fragile, so be careful with them. I start with the two on the engine deck. These are part E9. They're different to the rest in that they have mounting pins, which makes them pretty easy to get positioned nicely, despite their fiddliness. They look pretty nice. I'd hold them. If you see just below the vents on the side of the hull, there are some small circles moulded into the plastic. These are guides for the rest of the handrail, which are all part E8. There are no pins on the hand railings, so there's not much point in drilling holes for them or anything like that. I guess the guides are better than nothing, but I would much prefer all the hand railings were like the first two I installed. I guess maybe they are optional and it saves people that don't want to use them from having to fill in the holes. Of course, that makes installing these pretty tricky, but I do eventually get them into place. Not perfectly neatly, but it will do. It is then time to make some road wheels. The inner half of the wheel is part J2, and the outer part is J1. These have keying to ensure you get them lined up properly. It's a tiny raised nub that engages with the small ring of holes around the wheel hub. This is very easy and you should end up with 10 wheels. Each wheel gets a hubcap. This is part B1 and should obviously go on the outside of the wheel. You should be able to figure out which side that is by yourself. I then attach the very front of the hull. This is part E22. This is supposed to be used to join both the upper and lower parts of the hull, but I'm going to join it to the upper half only for now because I'm leaving the hull parts separated for painting. It goes into place easily like so. There's a couple of little tabs that go on the upper side. I then attach the road wheels. There's nothing special about this, and it's super easy to figure out where they should go. I like to give the wheels a little twist as I put them on, just to ensure the glue is nicely spread around in there. It is now time for the tracks. There are 2 jigs to help with this. Actually 4, because each track sprue has a pair of these jigs, but there are 2 different sizes of jig. They should make assembling the mostly individual track links easier. One of these jigs corresponds with the drive sprocket, and the other with the idler wheel. That makes sense, right? The jig does help, but it's still quite fiddly, though I did expect this. Personally, I think the fiddliness is worth it, and it looks better than the rubber band tracks. The unfortunate part is these track parts didn't have the best fit and needed significant cleanup. When joining the parts together, I carefully follow the diagram in the instructions to make sure I get all the track links in order. There should be a guide horn on every second link. I try to be careful and apply only a very small amount of glue in order to avoid gluing the track links to the jigs. To be sure, I carefully remove the tracks from the jig every now and then. It would be a massive pain if the tracks got stuck to the jig. When I had finished the first end of the track set, I decided that I would rather attach them to the model in sections, rather than trying to build an entire run of tracks in one part, as the instructions seem to suggest. Because of this, I next attached the idler wheels and the drive sprocket. In hindsight, I would suggest leaving the drive sprocket unglued to make it easier for the guide horns on the tracks to lock into it neatly. After I assembled both front and rear sections of track, I glued them onto the tank. It was pretty fiddly. My main problem with this are that the track parts don't really clip together in any way, and if you want them to look perfect, you're going to have to get the space between each track link perfect, which is absolutely not obvious from looking at the instructions. You pretty much have to guess what the best spacing for the track lengths is, and manage to keep it consistent without any guides or locking parts on these tracks. Very tricky. Mine ended up being quite sloppy looking, which, being a Soviet T-3485, is kind of acceptable, but there are still a few rather large gaps in the track links, most notable on the right rear. To be fair, this is a kit that cost $18, and while these tracks are a bit frustrating and definitely a fair amount of work, they're not that bad, and considering the rest of the model is pretty good and really detailed, I can't complain a whole lot. And it still does look better than rubber band tracks. I feel as though there is little choice now but to cover the tracks in mud as a way to hide all of the flaws here. It could be worse, but I do generally prefer my tanks to not be muddy. There are a couple of final details for the hull. The towing points for the rear of the hull, just like the front. The smaller of these parts is B16 and the larger B8. Very easy to get into place if you use tweezers, though be careful. One of the B16s slipped out of my tweezers as I was trying to install it and disappeared. Goodbye forever, tiny part. I'll have to hide that with mud too, I guess. Now we can move on to the turret. I'm going to have the hatches open, so the inside of the turret will be partially visible. So I'm going to have to put all of this stuff in here. I start by building the cannon. This is part D45 and it's pretty decent. Not much in the way of mold lines, and the end of the barrel is hollow. Looks good. The gun part is then sandwiched between the two halves of the gun breech. These are parts D18 and D19. The hole in the barrel locks it into the correct position, which is quite helpful. I apply some pressure to the parts, but I'm not too worried about a gap here because it won't be super visible anyway. Next, the hole in the left side of the breech is filled with this flat rectangle, like so. It is part D35. Part D36 goes on the other side. It's a little more detailed. The handle part should face upwards and towards the cannon. Onto this, I glue the breech handle. This is part C12. It's a little bit fiddly, but not hard to get into place. I'm not entirely sure I positioned it absolutely correctly, but it looked fine to me. Then comes part D3, which is the large flat plate that goes on the left side of the breech. It has a guide pin, which is helpful. Next comes D10. I'm not sure what it is, but it goes onto the bottom of the breech here. Onto the back of the breech I then glue part D17. As long as the part on the bottom is properly in place, this should go on nice and easy. And then onto the top of this assembly I put part D37. Again, I don't know what it is. It's a thing. I then join parts D28, D44, and D34 together to make the... let's pretend to be surprised that I don't know what it is. I don't think it's a breech guard, but it goes around the bottom of the breech. I then glue part D2 to the side of the gun breech. This goes on very easily. We need this part in order to attach the previous assembly to the gun. It goes onto the bottom here, like so. It was a little bit tricky to get into place properly. There's a couple of guide holes, but I'm not sure I did get it quite right, and it does look a little bit messy, but it could be worse. Next comes part D38. It slots into the right side of the gun. This is a holder for the coaxial machine gun that we'll add later. I then add part D29, which I forgot to do earlier. It's some kind of lever. Then I assemble what the instructions refer to as the collimator, however you say that. First, I take part D23, which is the handle, probably for gun elevation. I glue that onto part D15. Next comes part D26, which is a seat for the gunner to sit on, luxurious by Soviet standards. I then take part D30, which is the sight, and I glue on part D20, which is the eyepiece and headrest. I did initially have the headrest part on upside down, but eventually I fixed it before the glue entirely set. I then glue it onto the previous assembly. You can't see it very well, but the protrusion near the eyepiece should face upwards away from the seat. I put this aside for the glue to dry properly and move on to adding some details to the inside of the turret. I start by installing the vision device for the right side of the turret. This is part D32. This has a D-shaped keying on the part, so you can only put it in facing the right way. I follow this with part D21, which is some kind of handle. Whatever it is, it's tiny. Use of tweezers is essential here. Then part D5. I believe this is a side vision device, pretty easy to get into place. Next comes a rack for magazines of ammo for the coaxial machine gun. It is part E1. There's an outline to show you where this part should go, making it very easy to position. Not looking too bad so far. Next, I glue in part D14, which is a bracket of some sort, and then I add some stowed ammo. This is part D1, and it just goes right here on the wall. There are some raised circles on the wall that correspond with the pins on the back of the ammo part to help with positioning. Once the ammo is in place, I adjust the brackety part until I'm satisfied with how it looks. The left side of the turret also gets a vision device, so I glue that in now. It's also part D32, and of course it still has the D-shaped keying. I follow this with thing D42. It's some kind of control box. I used my knife to nudge it into place. There's an outline for its placement moulded into the turret part. Next comes the first of two of these, which I assume are more control boxes. They're part D24. Again, raised rectangular guides help position these. Then comes another of these handle things, or whatever they are, part D21, just as fiddly but easy as on the other side. I then add the second part D24 control box thing. Very simple. This is followed by D31, which I believe is the radio. It fits into place nicely on the two raised bars. This is going to be pretty visible through the hatch. I then glue the cannon and collimator thing assemblies together. This was pretty simple. I then put that entire assembly inside the turret, which was a lot more fiddly. They probably could have designed this a little better. The end of the collimator part forms the, I guess it's the trunnion part, that joins the gun to the turret itself. It took a bit of effort to get it all lined up nicely, and I'm not sure it will have a lot of strength, so I'm going to be very gentle with it. I make sure the gun is at the elevation that I want it, because it will be really hard, or more likely impossible, to change it once the glue here is dry. It doesn't look too bad, though it is a little bit messily put together. Is Russian tank is no problem. I left that assembly to dry just to make sure I didn't knock the parts out of place, and then I glued in the coaxial machine gun. This is part D40 and it slots in through the ring we glued into the side of the gun earlier. I used my knife to nudge it into a place that I think looks good and convincing. I then turn my attention to the main ammo storage rack in the back of the turret. All of these parts are a bit messy and needed some mold line removal before being glued on. This makes a fairly big stack of shells. The parts from top to bottom are D11, D9, D13, D8, D12, D7, and D13. There are guide pins and holes to assist in the proper placement of these parts. It did end up looking a bit messy. I'm hoping the darkness inside the turret will help disguise that messiness. The stack of ammo can then be glued into the back of the lower half of the turret. Nothing too tricky here. It's not the best looking, but it does look like what it's meant to be. This is followed by part D27, which is a wall plate part thing that goes towards the flat end of the shells. Next, I glue in the seat for the commander. It's part D25. I've chosen to leave this folded up. Nobody is going to yell at you for leaving the seat up in your own tank. I just wanted my view down into the fighting compartment to be less obstructed. I then assembled a control for the turret traverse. It was comprised of 3 parts, D39, onto which the handle part D22 is glued, and finally this box part, which is D41. All of these parts go together easily and it looks pretty decent. It glues into place here and there's a guide pin to ensure that the part goes into the correct spot. Thus concludes the construction of the turret interior. Next, I glue the vision devices into the commander's cupola. These are all part D4, and they simply sit in place like so. I used my knife to gently position them properly. I then attached the loader's hatch. It is part E20, and I am of course modelling it open. Next, I build the commander's cupola. This is part L7, into which I glued a periscope, part D33. Like the periscopes in the hull, this has the D-shaped keying. Then comes the hatch, which is part L8. I of course glued it open, though I wasn't entirely sure if maybe it should be open a bit further forward, but I think it looks fine as is. I glue it into place in the obvious location. There is a pin to help guide the part so it's facing the right way, which is obviously forward. I apply some pressure to try and minimize the gap, but it's still there and might need filling later. Then come the ventilator covers. These are part E19 and they look like boobies if you really use your imagination. I then add glue and slide the gun mantlet into place over the barrel. This is part E23. There is keying on the inside to make sure the part goes on the right way up. The mantlet doesn't quite fit perfectly, but it's not too bad. Then comes the little flappy bit that goes over the top of the mantlet. I don't know if this has a proper name. Anyway, the part is L3. It's not too hard to position nice and straight. Next, I glue on what I assume are the turret lift points. These are all part E26. They're very tiny, but not hard to install if you're careful and use tweezers. Continuing with the fiddly parts that need tweezers, I add hand railings to the outside of the turret. These are part E10 and they have holes to guide them, which is nice, much better than those on the side of the hull. And finally I add this antenna, which is part L2. The instructions do say to make your own antenna using the melted sprue method, but I didn't feel like doing that, so I used this part. The instructions then say to connect the hull and turret. There isn't anything to lock the parts together, so they just sort of sit together like so. Makes sense, it's a display model, not a gaming piece. And that's all there is to the construction of this model, or at least all I'm going to be doing until after the model is painted. I say that as though it was a quick and simple process. That was a lot of parts and it took a fairly long time. I feel like painting this is going to be a bit challenging and definitely time consuming, but I think in the end it's going to look pretty cool. This is probably the most detailed model I've ever built, and to be honest, when I bought this model, I wasn't expecting this level of detail at all. Not that I'm complaining, it's pretty cool, especially considering the model only cost $18. The model was fairly complicated to build, obviously, owing to all of the tiny parts, but I wouldn't say it was especially difficult. The instructions were clear enough and following them helped everything go together fairly smoothly. It certainly was time consuming though. It took me a few days to get this thing built and quite a while to get the video edited too. I think this might be the longest video I've ever done. That said, I did enjoy most of the time I spent building this. I did get a little bit frustrated with the tracks, but they weren't too bad really. When I did get frustrated, I just took a break and then came back to it later. I really quite like the level of detail this model has. Obviously, what you can see on screen now has gaps between the hull and turret halves. That's obviously because I need to keep them apart to paint the inside, and I think that can be overlooked for the purposes of this video. The parts will join together nicely in the end. This was the first Hobby Boss kit I've ever built, and it won't be the last. I know this because I already have another 2 in my pile of kits to build. So, what do you think? Have you built this kit? Another kit from Hobby Boss? Let me know in the comments below, along with any other questions, comments, and suggestions you might have. Also, don't forget to do all the YouTubey things such as clicking like if you liked the video, subscribing, sharing, and so forth. If you really like the things I make, please consider helping to support the channel via Patreon. Patrons get to see my videos a little bit earlier than everybody else, in addition to some patron-only bonus content. Check it out by clicking the link in the description and on screen now. As always, I shall return soon, so until then, happy modelling and thanks for watching. Farewell.